I'm Sarah Dimick. I am an assistant professor at Harvard University, which is located in Boston in the United States on the traditional homeland and ancestral homeland of the Massachusetts people. It is such an honor to be here with you today. I usually speak to literary critics and other people who work on literature, and it's always a treat to speak with people in other disciplines. I have found your talks over the last 2 days both informative and really fascinating. So today I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview of what is called climate fiction. We often refer to this in shorthand as cli-fi, which sounds a little bit like sci-fi. But it is an emerging genre of books, and one of the exciting things about climate fiction is trying to figure out how to understand this new genre as it evolves and as it emerges. So when I think about how to begin the story of climate fiction, it's always difficult to know where to start. The climate has impacted literary production since time immemorial. We could think about something as old as the Epic of Gilgamesh, which includes a massive flood, right? We could think about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was drafted in 1816. And if we have any historians in the room, you might know that 1816 in Europe was described as the year without a summer. Indonesia's Mount Tambora had erupted, and the resulting ash in the atmosphere had led to really gray, gloomy conditions in Europe during that time. So as she lived during these strange atmospheric conditions, Shelley is thinking about the limits of human agency and what it means to really tinker with environmental systems. And Frankenstein comes out of that particular time. We could also think about a work like The Grapes of Wrath, which was published in 1939, right on the heels of the Dust Bowl in the United States, when Steinbeck, who was located out in California, was really reflecting on the drought and the aridity and the resultant migration and poverty that came out of that climatic change. So while there are really important forerunners or predecessors like Frankenstein, like The Grapes of Wrath, I would not consider these works climate fiction in the way that we generally think about it today, because I think the genre that we are seeing emerge right now is really interested in anthropogenic climate change and really comes out of a consciousness of a global scale environmental crisis that neither Shelley nor Steinbeck were conceiving of at that time. So usually when I start this story, I start in 1993 with the publication of Octavia Butler's book, The Parable of the Sower. If you have not read this work, I highly recommend it. It is horrifying, it is prescient, and it feels deeply resonant of the times that we are living through. It starts in 2024, which is rapidly approaching. So I think it's an interesting time to return to this book. But I start here for a few reasons. First, Butler is known as a science fiction writer, and I think it's important to recognize that much of the work in climate fiction that we see really draws on and engages with some of the ideas and strategies developed by science fiction. So it's a nice connection in that sense. I also like starting with Parable of the Sower because it is extremely popular. It has stood the test of time. Just a few years ago, it appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. So 20 years after its publication, it again has this resurgence of sales. I think that's pretty remarkable. And then finally, I think it's really easy these days when we think about climate fiction to default to well-known writers who are typically white men. And I think positioning Butler as one of our foundational climate fiction writers is a really important reminder that so much of the work that is coming out of this genre is impacted by writing by Black American women. So 1993, we have Parable of the Sower. This is a really early example, and it's a reminder that Butler was quite ahead of her time. The genre as a whole does not take off until about into the first decade of the 21st century. So right about 2008, 2009, 2010, we see an explosion of climate fiction. And I think this is fascinating because it tracks the real explosion in anxiety and concern about anthropogenic climate change at that time, right? So while we had wide public consciousness of anthropogenic climate change as early as the 1980s, I think we see a real uptick in concern in the 21st century, and literature follows that trend. In 2009, in Britain, Sachi Lloyd publishes The Carbon Diaries, a fascinating story about carbon regulations and what it feels like to live under a carbon budget. 2010, we get works such as Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl, which is thinking about regimes of new energy, including spring energy and balloon air travel. We get Ian McEwan's Solar, which is one of our first works looking at art being created in the Arctic. And we get Antti Tuomainen's The Healer, which is a mystery set in a futuristic Helsinki. Then in 2012, Barbara Kingsolver's work, Flight Behavior, comes out. It is a portrayal of climate change on a poor rural farm in Appalachia. So much of climate fiction is set in urban centers, and so Flight Behavior remains an important depiction of the rural and also of the very real agricultural challenges that will emerge through a changing climate. Then in 2013, we have Alexis Wright's book, The Swan Book, which is a stunning and beautiful portrayal of human and animal migrations in Indigenous Australia. We have Nathaniel Rich's Odds Against Tomorrow, which everyone thinks was a portrayal of Hurricane Sandy in New York City, but was actually written before Sandy hit and then was published just after the flood. In 2017, we have Omar El-Akkad's American War, which I think is the most geopolitical work. It's really trying to think about international oil markets and the way that those impact national decisions, particularly within the United States, and how they map onto existing fault lines around racism and the continuing legacy of American slavery. We have Sherry Dimeline's book, The Marrow Thieves, which is an incredible story of the way that the long history of colonialism in North America is connected to the current climate crisis we are facing, and how to tell a multi-century story that really accounts for these longer histories. We also have Prayag Akbar's novel Layla, which comes out of India and is thinking about air purity and the way that that can map onto social purity and some of the restrictions that are put on women's lives. Rita Indiana's book Tentacle came out of the Dominican Republic in 2019 and is one of our most stellar engagements with oceanic life and the climate. And then in 2020, we have Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, which I think of as a bureaucratic novel. It's interested in the World Bank. It's interested in UN ministries. It tries to animate these very often slow-moving bureaucratic processes for its readers. We have Lydia Millett's A Children's Bible, which is my go-to recommendation if you are interested in generational distinctions or generational tensions during the climate crisis. It is narrated by a group of teenagers who are deeply upset at their parents. And then we have Rumaan Alam's book, Leave the World Behind, which unfolds during an environmental crisis and really tries to think through the uncanniness of that experience. So, from 1993 onwards, we see a huge explosion, and one of the challenges of working in this field is that every time I give this talk, I need to update this slide. I think we are going to see more and more and more work coming out, and this is only a small smattering of what already exists. I do want to do a few demographic breakdowns for you so you can see some of the trends within climate literature. Within Anglophone writing, or literature written in English, a lot of the works related to climate are really coming out of the United States. There's been a large outpouring of American climate fiction. But some of the most interesting works are originating elsewhere, and this is by no means an American genre. The UK has some fascinating examples. John Lanchester's book, The Wall, was recently nominated for the Booker Prize. So that's a particularly notable example. Ante Tuomainen's The Healer is a great example of the way that Nordic noir, or writing coming out of Scandinavia, is a real hotspot for thinking about climate and oil and petroaesthetics. From the Caribbean, we have a really exciting, rich array of work, and that is a place that I think will be fascinating to watch over the next decade as we see that literature become translated and really emerge. Again, from India, we have a strong showing of climate fiction, and then we also have works coming from indigenous communities and nations. The Marrow Thieves is by a Métis writer from present-day Canada, and The Swan Book is from a Wanyi writer from present-day Australia. We also cross a wide variety of categories and types of literature. So I think climate fiction is difficult to define because we can't say that it is all romances or all mysteries or all adventure stories. It doesn't fall into any particular type, and part of the excitement is watching how it crosses these borders. Some critics will describe it as somewhat of a magpie genre, where it picks from all of these different categories and then tries to utilize the work. So the ones I have on the screen here up on the left are what we might think of as serious literature or high fiction. These are by writers who are often granted major awards within the literary community, will be reviewed by major journals, and lead to lots of literary acclaim. They will be taught at schools. This next set is what we might think of as genre fiction. So fiction that comes more out of a science fiction tradition and has a really large community of fans. So while it may not be taught as frequently within an academic setting, its readership is potentially even larger. And these tend to be the books that people really feel passionately about and gravitate towards and will blog about and have podcasts discussing. So these are highly, highly popular works. Other page turners that you might pick up, say if you were at an airport, would be things like Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior or The Mystery of the Healer. Flight Behavior, at least within the United States, was a really frequent book club pick. So I grew up in a very, very small town in rural Minnesota, and my local library decided that Flight Behavior was going to be the book that this small town read together over the course of a few months. So it has had a lot of circulation, and I think one of the things books can do is really bring people together into these conversations that might not otherwise occur, and we see some of these more popular works functioning in that sense. And then finally, I would be remiss if I did not mention young adult writing. Oftentimes, books that are targeted at teenagers or young adults are not considered serious or worth our attention. And I really want to warn us against that in the case of climate fiction. I think so much of the activism and organization that we see happening around climate change is being carried out by teenagers and young adults. And understanding the sorts of stories and imaginaries that they are gravitating towards and that they are impacted by is really crucial for trying to understand how they perceive the future that they will inherit. So some of these young adult works are really trying to shape what teenagers are thinking about and the sorts of possibilities that they see for themselves. Because we are thinking about health and climate change together these 2 days, I did want to spend the last part of my talk just highlighting a few of the trends that I see within climate fiction when I think about health. And I will note here that literature is not a useful prognostic device. It does not help us predict the future. It often is not factual. And for that reason, sometimes people take it less seriously. But I think what it does do is that it gives us an environment or a world in which we can meditate and think about these issues together. So it's a reflection tool in that sense. It's also one of the few arenas where we chart quite deliberately hopes and fears and possibilities. So that's the method through which I approach health. I think the most obvious thing to note would be that we do see epidemics and pandemics in a good amount of climate fiction. And when we see epidemics and pandemics in literature more broadly, they are often quite apocalyptic. We will see huge swaths of humanity die off in these stories. And while I can think of a few examples like that within climate fiction, I would say that the genre as a whole, and I will note Chang-Rae Lee's wonderful book on Such a Full Sea here, what we see more often happening are a chronic form of epidemics or pandemics, diseases that do not kill people in great numbers, but that cause lingering disease and disability that become part of the story and part of the world that characters inhabit. So that's an interesting shift as writers try to imagine the future. We see a lot more chronic epidemics and pandemics. We also see a very strong focus in this genre on mental health. And I will point to two examples here. The first one is Jenny Offel's recent book, Weather, which is about a white upper-class woman who lives in New York City and in many ways should be quite isolated from the anxiety of climate change. Her privilege is something that to some degree insulates her. But what we see over the course of this narrative is just this back burner anxiety that percolates and suffuses through everything she thinks about. So even within this protected echelon of her world, we see a depiction of extreme anxiety that really shapes her process of thought. When we look at works that are set in more extreme climatic change, like the parable of the sower, where we have had extreme fire, drought, large changes to the earth systems, then what we see happening is a much more overt sense of mental health and an awareness of the stresses that people live under. And I think Parable of the Sower is a fascinating book to think with here because the main character in this book, Lauren, has a fictional condition called hyperempathy syndrome, in which she can feel the pain and the suffering of everyone around her. And when I teach this work, my students really latch onto this. I think for so many young adults at this moment, thinking ahead to the climate crisis and thinking about the elements of the climate crisis that we are already living within, they feel like it's this constant washing over them of pain and suffering, both for themselves and for others, and trying to live with that constant sense of pain and suffering and damage can be quite debilitating for a lot of young adults. And so they really connect with Lauren's experience of hyperempathy. But as the story goes on, Lauren comes to realize that hyperempathy is an absolute skill as well as a condition. It allows her to acknowledge the ways in which humans are connected and in which we share this life together and our experiences become quite porous. So it is a condition that increases her sense of compassion and in some ways even increases her capacity to cooperate. And then finally, one of the things that has really struck me as I have read these works is that we see a real rise in mutual aid societies. So we don't see in this literature many depictions of hospitals or health insurance or functioning bureaucratic healthcare. Instead, what we see, especially in our more extreme works that are thinking about communities on the road or communities that have been displaced, we see a real emphasis on mutual aid, where we will have a skilled medic taking care of a neighborhood, or where we will have a small community of people who are trying to collaboratively combine their skills in order to offer care and medical assistance to those in need. So it tends to happen in these informal care networks rather than through official channels. And a lot of this, I think, does come out of this sense of crisis, but it also emerges from the sense in literature that we are entering an age in which caring for those around you is such a strong moral imperative. In Rumaan Alam's Leave the World Behind, one character muses, the character says, "You demanded answers, but the universe refused. Comfort and safety were just an illusion. Money meant nothing. All that meant anything was this: people in the same place together. This was what was left to them." So that is the overwhelming feeling that we get within these novels, a real value on togetherness, on connection, on community, even within the face of fairly dire crisis. I will just conclude by saying that there is a wide array of writing within climate fiction. And for those of you who are interested in delving into these books, I'm happy to offer suggestions. I do love giving reading suggestions, but you really can't start at a wrong place. And I think climate fiction can be a place to turn to when you are imaginatively or intellectually at an impasse. Sometimes fiction can creatively untangle some of the knots that we are facing in other disciplines. And it is also perhaps a bit of a refuge to know that there are other thinkers out there grappling with these large questions. Thank you so much.